Time is yours.
Thank you very much, and I apologize that I have to run to the airport, but the nature of my life is that I have to take a plane home so I can catch a plane for the next trip, with one day at the UN in between. So I do apologize for leaving early, but I want to thank the ADB for a wonderful 2 days of discussions. I think the sessions have been really superb, and they have been about the most challenging and complex issues in a very deep way. So I'm very, very grateful to the bank, and I'm very happy that Cheng Jin Wei is back on his feet and with us today, which is a great relief also. So this is good news. When we talk about green development, we're talking about a very complex subject, because the world economy has grown roughly 100-fold in the last 2 centuries, while the Earth has grown not at all. And the pressures on the physical environment are across many, many domains, from biodiversity to ecosystem functions to atmospheric, oceanic, and terrestrial chemistry to climate change. It's not surprising, therefore, that all of the green development issues are extraordinarily complex, and they are much more than changes on the margin. They require quite fundamental changes of technology and behavior and organization in order to stay within planetary boundaries. I would say, and I'll not say more about this, that there are 4 great thematic areas to discuss, in my opinion. One is the energy system, which is at the core of the issue of climate change. The second is the agriculture and land use system, which is fundamental for biodiversity and ecosystem functions. The third is the organization of cities with the waste, industrial cycles, energy, transport, and settlements use, where about 80% of world economic output takes place, where 55% of the world's population lives, and where soon it will be 70 or 80%. And the fourth area, which I hope is not going to be remaining a huge area of concern 3 or 4 decades from now, is the continued growth of the global population, which the 2015 UN revision that came out this week now calls for a projection of 11.2 billion, I think it is, by 2100. This is too much, and it is largely based on still unchecked fertility rates in much of Africa and in parts of Asia. And it's driven by fertility fundamentally. So fertility rates do need to come down on a voluntary basis as fast as possible. There's a lot known how to do that, especially keeping girls in school. Enabling them to stay in school is the single most important intervention. But if we try to have sustainable development with 11 billion people, it's going to be a lot harder. We can't even do it with 7.3 billion people, much less with 11 billion people. So we had better get more serious about that. I want to talk about just the energy nexus today, because we need, by the time of Paris, to have a much better understanding of what is really involved in climate change mitigation. And I think for the bank also, standards of what is meant by appropriate energy technology and energy investments are very important. Basically, I want to talk you out of coal investments, whether they're supercritical or not supercritical. The future of the world climate system depends on us getting out of coal. except to the extent that there is significant real carbon capture and sequestration. But even with that, it's not going to accommodate much of the CO2. It's just too expensive and too much of a new industry to expect that it's going to offset a large proportion of the current emissions, which are around 34 billion tons per year. And we need to get to very low emissions levels by mid-century and essentially to net zero emissions in the second half of the 21st century, and to think very hard quantitatively, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively about how that can be done. So this is the famous IPCC picture with the reference concentration pathways. The top curve, RCP 8.5 is a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius increase of temperatures against the pre-industrial baseline. It's considered to be the BAU path, the business as usual path, or some combination of the top curve with the RCP 6, the reference concentration pathway 6, which is basically a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increase, are the two business as usual paths. The lower path is the RCP 2.6 that has a 2/3 chance of remaining below the 2 degrees Celsius. Now, what this famous diagram has on the x-axis is this century, and on the y-axis is emissions of CO2 or carbon. The way this particular graph is shown is it's petagrams of carbon, which to translate to CO2 multiply by 3.6. So we're emitting right now about 10 billion tons of C, or about 36 billion tons of CO2 per year. And in order to have even a 2/3 chance of remaining below 2 degrees Celsius, we have to bend the curve to the lower curve. What's notable about the lower curve is that it goes through 0 by 2070. In other words, 0 net emissions of CO2 by 2070. The integral of that curve from today to 2070 is about 875 billion tons of CO2. In other words, that's the carbon budget that is still consistent with honoring the 2 degrees C curve. That curve would be a fundamental transformation of the world energy system. It has nothing to do with modest changes of greater efficiency or going from coal to gas, or even from low efficiency coal to supercritical high efficiency coal use. Those are consistent with the middle curves perhaps, but not with staying below the 2 degrees Celsius. And so if we're serious about the 2 degrees C, and I spoke yesterday briefly about why we should be, and I won't speak too much more about it now except to say again, we should be, because the best scientists that I know say 2 degrees is already recklessly too high. So as I mentioned, my colleague James Hansen basically says to me every day, when you say 2 degrees, I'm going to kill you. That is too dangerous for the world. And I say, Jim, we can barely have a chance to stay below 2 degrees. He says, yes, but tell people that's not a comfort zone. That is a red-hot flashing danger zone. So I won't belabor the point, just to say, what's our chance of staying below 2 degrees C? Well, to do that, we have to decarbonize. And essentially, we have to get to 0 by around 2070, plus changing the direction of land use as well. Land use right now is somewhere around 15% of the emissions, maybe 10% of the emissions. Nobody knows really, because we don't close the carbon budget statistically with high precision. but maybe it's 4 or 5 tons of CO2 net emission per year from terrestrial deforestation and land degradation. We have to turn that to capture biologically probably something on the order of 100 billion tons carbon or 300 billion tons carbon dioxide captured in soils and reforestation and afforestation. This is a huge, huge enterprise, in other words. So a lot is known about how practically we could decarbonize. It is technically feasible. It's even economically feasible. Economically feasible meaning that the incremental costs look realistically to be well under 2% of global output per year, and most likely well under 1% of global output per year. In a way, it's a no-brainer, except that the amount of change that it will take in the actual investments we make and the continuing technological improvements that will be required are large. But they're not technological improvements beyond the current engineering potential. They're technological improvements that are within sight. This is not about fusion energy or about giant mirrors out in space or other inventions. It's about improved battery performance, improved grid management, and so forth, all within reach. The strategy of decarbonization for every good study that I've seen, and certainly for all the best studies, says that there are 3 components to it. The first is energy efficiency, where we do have significant savings, where through capital investments of various kinds, we can get the same output services for considerably less energy inputs, usually capital energy transformation, but sometimes pure savings through better design of buildings and so forth. The second is a radical decarbonization of power generation. This is fundamental. We need essentially zero carbon electricity. To give you the core of this, a coal-fired power plant emits something on the order of 1,100 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, or something like 1.1 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour produced. A gas-fired power plant does half of that. So maybe it's 500 grams per kilowatt hour. A supercritical coal-fired power plant is something like 750 grams per kilowatt hour. Much better than a lousy coal plant, low efficiency, not even as good as a gas-fired power plant. But we need to get not to 750 or 500 by mid-century. We need to get to about 50 grams. Let me say that again. We need to go from the current average of 700 or 800 grams per kilowatt hour down to about 50. Most of the energy we produce, most of the power, should be zero carbon. So that's fundamental. And then the third part of the strategy is use clean electricity everywhere. Use clean electricity for the personal mobility sector, for the cars, move out of internal combustion engines. Use clean electricity to produce hydrogen for hydrogen vehicles to the extent that we're going to use fuel cells. Use electricity for buildings, especially getting rid of boilers and furnaces and turn over to heat pumps, and use clean electricity for perhaps 40% or 50% of the current heat process in industry. So that's the formula: high energy efficiency, clean power, and electrification. And when you analyze this, this can be accomplished in all major economies, but there are big question marks that are not solved. And of course, it is for the biggest economies in general where the question marks are large, and especially for China and India, because you have the two biggest economies of this region that are in population and will be in GDP, and certainly China already in GDP, that are coal-based economies and that have to find alternatives in real time and still grow and still develop. The pathways to do this have not been well worked out. We've wasted 20 years of analytical time to work on this. And unfortunately, climate negotiations have very little to do with this. Climate negotiations for the first 23 years have been who's going to do what first, not what to do. And so countries are basically told, solve your problem. And if you look at the reports of ADB also, they're not really about deep decarbonization so much as about how do we balance a little bit less carbon, a little bit more efficiency. They're not really analyzing yet the pathways to deep decarbonization. And how could China get to net zero by 2070? How could India get to net zero? How can the United States get to net zero? Not a question for ADB, but a question for the world. And that's the kind of analysis that is urgently needed. Now, we at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network have, for the last 2 years, been looking at this with country teams for the 15 major emitting economies in a project called Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And the teams were assigned not even the full 2070 challenge, but a 2050 challenge. We said if the world is going to go from 36 billion tons per year today, or 34 billion tons per year, depending on what's precisely measured, down to something like 12 billion tons by 2050 on the path to zero, and you divide 12 billion tons by 9.6 billion people, you have to get down to something like 1 to 1.5 tons per capita everywhere to accomplish this. And China right now is at about 9 tons per capita, and the United States is at 18 tons per capita. And the world standard needs to be somewhere between 1 and 1.5 tons per capita by 2050. So we assign the teams the task for your country, get down to between 1 and 1.5 tons, and we're not going to talk about burden sharing right now because every major economy in the world is going to have to do this, period. Burden sharing will be who helps to pay for that in the end. That's a different matter, but not what you need to do. No big economy can stand outside of this because the carbon budget won't allow that. Turns out it's not easy for our energy modelers to even accomplish that task because the current energy models are too conservative. They're based on existing technologies without allowing for enough radical change that is possible but isn't built into the models, like getting to all electric vehicles by the 2030s, which is something certainly feasible, but it would require a fundamental political decision at the global level that this is the direction that we need to head. Without that, we don't decarbonize deeply. So if you do that exercise, it turns out with enough time, it's possible for every major economy to find pathways. Though I will say that for India, it's hard. For China, it's hard. For the United States, which has every kind of renewable imaginable, we've got great deserts, we've got great wind, it's a bit easier to do. But this is the analysis, in my view, that every economy has to do, and most governments have not done yet. So I'm just illustrating the US pathway for getting to near zero electricity emissions. And this is one of several scenarios, because the US team did a scenario with nuclear power and without nuclear power, with carbon capture and sequestration and without carbon capture and sequestration. The more options you take off the table, the more expensive it is, of course. But if you want to satisfy different political constituencies, you can say, if you don't want nuclear, it's going to cost another X $100 billion a year to do. But here are the options. So this is an example of one of the runs that includes both nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration to a modest extent. And what you can see is that the primary energy sources for the power sector change fundamentally from basically coal in the United States, with some gas, or coal and gas, I should say, in 2014, to almost no fossil fuel power generation other than the part with carbon capture and sequestration, a buildup of nuclear capacity, pretty much the same hydro because we don't have much new hydro that we can bring on, a lot of wind in this scenario because there's tremendous wind potential, and a buildup of solar. Of course, different options give different scenarios, but this just shows what a typical pathway can bring about. And this leads to 50 grams per kilowatt hour in the United States by 2050. So it works to satisfy the basic constraint. And in the end, the internal combustion engine is basically phased out. The underlying principles of this scenario is that there's almost no premature scrappage of capital. So plants are not shut down prematurely and vehicles are not scrapped, but the rule is to roll out the old and to roll in the new at the maximum possible rate. And that is enough at what turns out to be about 0.5% of GDP incremental cost, measured in terms of the resource cost for the energy sector to make this transformation. Of course, the benefits are much larger than that. You avoid environmental disaster of runaway climate change. But there are incremental costs. This is not free from the point of view of the energy systems, but they're very modest, well under 1% of GDP per year. And that pathway has now been elaborated in a report that we're going to release next month, a far more detailed report of how this can be done region by region within the United States as well. This is a slide I just pulled this morning from the IEA, reminding us that supercritical, ultra supercritical, and so forth, coal-fired power plants are completely outside true deep decarbonization pathways. They're just at an order of magnitude too high emissions to be regarded as answers for this. And so too is natural gas, which was a big fad for a few years, that we're going to go to gas rather than coal, and that's going to solve the climate problem. Gas is 500 grams per kilowatt hour, and we need to get to 50. So gas, in my view, isn't even a stepping stone, which is how it was described. And interestingly, in President Obama's Clean Power Plan that was released just a couple of days ago, the emphasis on gas has been taken sharply down, and there's shock of the American Petroleum Institute and other lobbies. Where's the gas? We thought you were pro-gas. And finally, the Obama administration came around this week much more honestly to the need for a massive buildup of renewables as part of the answer. My own view, by the way, is that a significant buildup of nuclear almost surely has to be part of this story as well. I have significant doubts from everything that I've heard that this can really be accomplished while phasing out the nuclear industry. But on the other hand, there's so little work on the nuclear fourth generation and improved safety and so forth that public acceptance of nuclear is really, perhaps understandably, at rock bottom right now. But the environmental community also is not, in my view, very straight up on these issues, because the environmental community generally is radically opposed to nuclear. It's radically opposed to carbon capture and sequestration, but it doesn't put forward real scenarios. It puts forward slogans, and it doesn't understand that running on intermittent power is quite different from having base load energy. And so it has not really offered very deep solutions. The thing that I think we've all found, but I've seen about the environmental community, is that there is no good energy source, but we all need electricity. Because the environmentalists oppose hydropower, they oppose wind as long as it's near their cottages or farms. They certainly oppose nuclear power, they oppose carbon capture and sequestration, and they even oppose solar power often because of the vast land area that it takes in desert regions and the disruptions to local ecosystems. The fact is there is no energy system that doesn't have some costs. But my shorthand is that the costs of the climate disruption are the biggest of all. And so we ought to be taking radical steps on fighting the CO2 emissions and accepting the consequences of power lines or unsightly windmills or large land in deserts covered by solar panels or nuclear as all plausible, responsible answers as improved alternatives. Now, we need, in addition to these pathways, we do need improved technologies along the way. There are learning curves everywhere. And I just mentioned on the list some of the major advances that are needed, but I would say the single most important advance is better storage for intermittent energy. And that for the mobility fleet, the personal mobility for the automobiles comes down to better batteries to a very significant extent as a huge opportunity absolutely within technological reach, but requiring a lot more investment and a lot more strategy for acceleration. So here's a list of some of the things we need. We need to be testing carbon capture and sequestration far more aggressively, storage of renewable energy, whether it's batteries, synthetic liquids, and many, many other solutions that are proposed. Zero emission vehicles where they exist and they're good and they're very high performance, but they don't have the performance characteristics yet, largely because of batteries, recharging, and so forth, that they need to completely replace the internal combustion engines. Fourth generation nuclear energy, the integral fast reactor, for example, is an extremely promising technology that was pulled off of the research agenda by the Clinton administration almost unaccountably, but its performance and safety characteristics and fuel cell cycle in terms of fissile materials is highly favorable, but there's almost no research being done on it anywhere right now. We need to be able to manage smart grids with high renewable penetration, advanced biofuels and synthetic fuels, direct air capture of CO2, combined with solar energy or other renewable energy to make synthetic liquid fuels, and further advances in solar photovoltaics. All of these are, I would call, normal science. There are large research programs around the world on them, but they could all be tremendously accelerated because we underinvest in the basic research, development, and demonstration by an order of magnitude in renewable energy right now, in low carbon energy. Maybe global investments well, U.S. investments are on the order of about $2.5 billion a year, and they should be on the order of $25 or $30 billion a year. And the major countries, China, the U.S., Japan, Korea, Canada, Australia, the EU, should be partnering to accelerate these technologies because trillions of dollars are at stake to get this right, but we're simply not making the public goods investments. And one of the things that I think we should be emphasizing is that almost all modern, large-scale technological breakthroughs have had a huge public investment component to them. Almost every major breakthrough of modern science has had a large public investment component in the last 100 years, usually from the military, by the way, because the military is the one place where nobody argues about public goods investments. And God forbid we should spend public money without war, but we haven't figured that out yet. But if we did that, we would actually be able to accelerate these technologies tremendously. So let me just summarize what I think would be a good agreement at COP21. One is to honor the 2 C upper limit as a minimum standard. And that means that the world would agree on a carbon budget. It would agree on deep decarbonization. It would agree on the need to fully decarbonize the world energy system in the second half of the 21st century. And quite notably, the G7 made this commitment in June in Germany for the first time. It spoke of full decarbonization in the 21st century. The agreements that we're going to have legally binding, these INDCs, are going to be rather modest to 2030. And the truth is you can't decarbonize a modern economy by 2030 because the infrastructure is too long-lived and it's going to take to 2050 or 2060 to do it. So one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize as a fundamental part of this agreement is that we need to extend the time horizon of the agreement, which is quite tricky. And the French government, I've been working closely with the team, is advocating that governments put on the table indicative pathways to the year 2050. Not legally binding pathways, but that every major economy at least has to show how they intend to deeply decarbonize, though not in a legally binding way, because no government will bind to 2050. And when you do say legally binding, then what governments agree to is very minimal. It's not the honest path, it's what they're sure they can do without huge costs politically and huge risks. So we need a mechanism to get governments to be thinking about the much deeper paths and displaying those deeper paths to the world public, and then using the peer knowledge to be building these deeper pathways and using that to guide future investment decisions in energy. And that is what I call these bold, aspirational, deep decarbonization pathways, DDPs, to 2050, and that they would be presented to the world by 2017. I pushed this at the White House, and they agreed to it. But they asked me one question: when are they due? And they wanted to know, are they due in 2016 before the presidential election or in 2017 after the presidential election? I said, you can do your homework after the presidential election. They said, then we're in. So as long as it doesn't get too political too fast, the idea of deep decarbonization pathways, I think, can be accepted. So finally, 2 parts is global agreements on technology development and climate financing, the famed $100 billion package, which has not been well developed yet, but where ADB and the Green Climate Fund and other multilateral development banks should play a huge role in this financing. The final point I want to make is that I want to encourage the Asian Development Bank to take up the analytics of deep decarbonization. because I think it's vital for you to be able to guide your own investment planning and your investment advising to the member states, because we have to get on a pathway to get the job done. And the only way to do that is to first work out the arithmetic of this. And the arithmetic is a lot more painful than we think. And it's a great exercise to do the arithmetic, because then you realize what's really at stake. And what's really at stake is a much more radical transformation than we have allowed for. But when you analyze it, it's a transformation that is technologically and economically and financially achievable if we decide to do it. Thank you very much. Sorry.
All right, thank you. Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation on the possible strategy of decarbonization. Again, unfortunately, Professor Jeff Sachs has to leave earlier to catch the plane, but I think we can have one or two direct comments or burning questions for him, if any, from the panel or from the floor. I would like to limit on just 2 comments or questions or just burning statement from your side to directly to Prof. Sachs. I open for the floor. I saw one on the left. Is there any from the right? Okay, we are going to the left now. Please.
Thank you for a terrific talk again.
Can you just sit down right there?
The disconnect that you mentioned yesterday as well, the scientific knowledge, knowledge of what needs to be done, even the financing in some sense, but the economic framework that allows us to project that countries can grow at 6% forever with no reference to climate change. And so we can have seminars here on this topic and a parallel seminar elsewhere on the economics where the finance ministers can't believe that in the near term, medium term, and even the long term, growth projections are pretty much untouched by the climate story. How do we bridge this disconnect? Otherwise, we'll still be talking.
I think for me, the point is how we grow, if we're going to grow. First, there is no way to maintain growth with runaway climate change. This, I think, should be very clear. There is no capacity of the world to adapt to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius increase. If we say we're going to just have ongoing business as usual growth and we'll just learn to adapt, we're going to have a disaster. And the reason is because major regions of the world are going to become virtually uninhabitable. This is already happening in many dryland parts of the world. The Middle East is not in generalized war only because of politics. It's in war because the ecological conditions are really miserable and getting worse. And this is going to be true in a lot of regions as well. If we happen to have the sea level disaster that I mentioned yesterday and mentioned briefly again today, then we're going to also have hundreds of millions of people absolutely displaced. Now, our world is not very good when it's small numbers. We fall to pieces. So with large numbers, we're going to have chaos. And that's why we should be avoiding the runaway climate change. Now, if you turn it around, you can ask a different question. Suppose we decoupled growth from CO2 emissions. Is that feasible? That's what this is really discussing. The deep decarbonization pathways are all based on continued growth scenarios. The starting point for this project was to take a convergence scenario, assume continued economic growth, and then say, can you supply the energy services implied by that growth through this combination of efficiency, zero carbon electricity and fuel switching or electrification? The answer is yes. So I'm not an end growth advocate or stop growth to live within the climate constraint. I'm for decarbonization. Basically, like our trade theory always tells us, go for the first best solution to aim at the real problem. Our real problem is not energy, our real problem is not growth, our real problem is carbon dioxide. So go after the carbon dioxide. Don't say we won't have energy or don't say we won't have growth. Go after what really ails us. Of course, you have to prove that it's possible to do that. And with respect to decarbonization, I believe it is. With respect to overall sustainable development, let me make a general point. There are no integrated global scenarios that describe true pathways of sustainable development, even to the middle of this century worldwide. What do I mean by that? There are no integrated assessments that show that we can live within the biodiversity constraints, the land constraints, the water constraints, the energy, the CO2, the climate constraints, and have the kind of convergent growth that we aim for, and that all fits together. My sense is that there is such a path. There is such a sustainable development trajectory that's feasible. But you can't look it up in a book, because nobody's done that analytical work, which is rather deep work, to make sure that all the constraints can really be observed. If the OECD does a growth scenario, it doesn't pay any attention to the environment. The IMF doesn't know anything about it. The IPCC looks just at the greenhouse gas emission part. It doesn't look at the land use part. It doesn't look at the population demographics and so forth. So for that reason, I've started a project with IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis outside of Vienna, to create a scenario of sustainable development. And we're asking major institutions that manage large-scale models to participate in this so we can see if it's possible to honor all of these constraints simultaneously. The land constraints, the food constraints, the population dynamics, and so forth. And we call it the World in 2050 project. And we've had our inception meeting on this and verified that the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, and others that each maintain large models, none of them has anything close to an integrated assessment that actually puts all of the pieces together, IFPRI, which does it on food supply and so forth. So we're trying to push all of this together. I would like to invite the ADB to be part of that, and we'll provide you the information of what that means. But this is I think the honest answer to your question about growth is we just don't know, actually, how all of these constraints work together, because we all look at this in a very partial way. And what I described in the talk just now is one piece that I'm relatively confident on, and that is we can de-link carbon dioxide emissions from growth. We have to show that we can do the same thing with land degradation, deforestation, food supply, water accessibility, and so forth. We have to show that we can make those delinkages work through appropriate policies, pricing, technology systems. And that hasn't been done on a comprehensive basis. So we've adopted sustainable development goals. They're up to 2030. They're not as fundamental as deep decarbonization, but we don't really know whether it's feasible analytically, even from a prospective point of view. And so there's a lot of analytical work to do to get to that point. But for an institution like the ADB, which is the lead institution responsible for helping countries forge investment pathways, as we were just talking about in the previous session, the more work that can be done on the analytics of this, the better to understand what are those sustainable paths and what needs to be avoided.
Thank you. Thank you. One more very brief, maybe, from former Minister Basri, please.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. This one, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy your talk, Professor Sachs. I would like to pick up your brain on how to push through this idea among the decision makers. We do understand that there are some supports from some leaders now, but it's very nominal in the sense that the commitment is there, but the implementation is very difficult. In some emerging markets, we're still struggling with the issue of poverty, unemployment. So to sell this agenda, how can we link this issue with the issue of this poverty and unemployment? So the decision maker will see that the problem is something that they immediate to respond, because their term is only for 5 years, 10 years maximum, and there is no interest for them to look at for the long-term issues, which is not part of their political interests. So how do the political economy in selling this idea? I would like to hear from your view.
Yeah,
thank you.
It's great and very complicated question. And for Indonesia, which is a major coal producer, a big question, for example, because this is not pleasant information, and it really poses very, very big questions. So my feeling is, first, when we have goals globally, like 2 degrees C, we need to take them seriously. And so we need to understand what we mean by these words, because the politicians don't necessarily care so much about the consistency of what they state and what needs to be done. Like you say, it's not quite their job, or not their job as they perceive it. So it's our job as analysts, as technocrats, as people who spend their lives trying to run numbers and understand what these linkages mean. So I believe the more study we look, the more we understand what the options are. I think it's extremely important for every country, every big country like Indonesia or India or China or the United States, to ask the question, is there a path for us that doesn't wreck our country, that doesn't stop our economic growth, and so on. And it's not self-evident. That's why this has to be downscaled country by country. No politician should, in my view, say, for the sake of the world, we're going to do this, but it stops our development. A politician needs to have an answer. Well, what do you suggest for us? If we're going to sell less coal in 10 years, what really are you saying we're going to do more of? So I think that this has to be looked at straightforwardly. And if the answer is there's no answer for country X, that needs to be put into the scenario. A safety valve for all such calculations should be, but rarely is, international transfers and financing. So if there's real adjustment difficulty for some countries, the theory is that we have international financing to help that adjustment. We know how poor that is, how weak that is right now. But if we really analyze deeply what's involved, and then found out that this also needs hundreds of billions of dollars of financing to enable growth to go ahead with decarbonization, those numbers would not look so terrifying if they were looked at systematically over a period of 25 years. And I believe that the great safety valve that we have not used yet is carbon taxation, because the simple calculations are easy. We're emitting 30 billion tons per year, and if we were to price carbon even at $10 for the point of view of raising public goods, that's 300 billion a year. That's not small change. And a normal price of carbon might be $40. And so now you're talking about $1 trillion a year of spare change to help different countries, to help make the adjustment process. So of course we don't discuss any of this honestly at the political level. and it's zero part of the negotiations. There's no content in the negotiations, actually, because that's all left to the countries. And the worst part for the developing countries, by the way, is that most of the technologies that Indonesia will need will not come from inside Indonesia. So if Indonesia has to model, what does it mean for us to have zero-emission vehicles, you have to be able to take knowledge of what kind of capacity there is to commit to that. Or what about carbon capture and sequestration? That's not going to be a technology developed inside Indonesia, but possibly used in Indonesia. So we need a lot more cooperation on the technology pathways and the technology assessments than we have right now. But again, in the rich countries, this is all private intellectual property rights, so they don't even want to discuss this honestly, because companies are involved and not the public policy dimension. So that's all negative. But what I've seen in this past year is that you can push reality a bit in the faces of the politics, because people are scared, governments are scared. They know that we're on a disastrous course right now. So the discussion has opened up in a new way. And the discussion basically is China says, we know we have to do big things because this is going to ruin us and we're the #1 emitter in the world. Clearly what President Obama is doing is recognizing a big change of American politics. In Canada and Australia, which are petro or mining countries, they're also saying, well, we can't fight the reality. If the US is going to do this, we're going to have to go along. India is kind of borderline because India's got a very hard set of challenges. But Prime Minister Modi has said repeatedly, we're on side on this agenda, but you show us technologically what's possible. We're not going to sacrifice growth, but show us the pathway. Well, that's an invitation to us, I believe. You can't expect the government to do it, but you can expect the government to be responsive to the evidence. And so I think we need to push hard a knowledge-based approach to this, not expect it to come out of the negotiations, but take it as our responsibility to push very hard on getting answers to these questions and not expecting the politicians to be heroes, but insisting at least that they be honest to the evidence.
Okay, I have a sign from the back that Professor Sachs has to leave now to catch the flight. Thank you so much for fascinating presentations. Wish you all the safe flights as well as all the best.